What's up everybody, it's FYJP and today I want to take a look at this video by Al Jazeera titled Has Bashar al-Assad won the war in Syria? And they're gonna bring up a Russian expert and this guy right here who looks like a caveman. He is basically gonna argue for the Syrian terrorists and tell the interviewer how they are good guys and how Russia is just indiscriminately killing civilians all the time, and how Assad is a monster and a war criminal and whatever. Let's take a listen.
Failure, President Obama's biggest failure?
I think on the foreign policy front, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's this woman too right here. She is basically spouting the talking points of the United States regarding Syria. Let's start a couple of seconds earlier, where you will hear her say some stuff that really made me laugh because it was so fucking ridiculous.
Is successful.
Okay, this is the Russian guy, this is the Syrian rebels guy, and this is the US woman who basically engaged in a debate on Al Jazeera English regarding Syria.
As a political solution, that the ultimate goal is the political solution, then of course the conflict is really far from over. And I think this year is going to be quite challenging for all parties involved, internally and external as well.
Mara, you said at a recent US congressional hearing that, quote, Assad won his war to stay in power. A lot of people would say that's because of the United States and its refusal to get more involved in getting rid of him. Is that fair or not?
I think the United States played a role. The international community more broadly played a role. The timing of the conflict.
Yeah, another think tank that argued for the invasion of the Middle East. Despicable people, really.
In the throes of other conflicts erupting and uprisings across the region, no doubt also did too. And frankly, those inside Syria have their own agency. You know, this idea, though, of what Assad wins is a pretty interesting one to think about.
Well, you should have thought about that earlier, because it does look like he is winning the war, and it looked like it for quite some time. And it's not an idea, it's a reality. Assad has practically already won the war in Syria.
No doubt won a long-term insurgency, even as he tries to take more and more control of Syrian territory. He's also won some sort of interesting dynamics with the Russians, the Iranians, and Hezbollah. What do they see as their long-term goal in Syria? What do they plan to do? What sort of weapon systems do they want to keep in Syria? What sort of military presence? What sort of activities do they want to launch from Syria? So his winning is not an entirely positive affair, even in his eyes, I suspect.
But you worked in the Pentagon during the Obama era. Would you call Syria his biggest failure, President Obama's biggest failure?
I think on the foreign policy front, absolutely.
Because he did not launch a full-scale invasion, right? Should have launched a full-scale invasion and, you know, made a second Iraq war and everything, and killed a bunch of more people, and removed Assad from power. Because we all know, if we remove this one guy who is the evil man who is controlling everything behind the scenes, if we remove this one dictator, everything will be, you know, fine and dandy in Syria. Except it will be not. It will get much worse. Because if Assad is out of power, a lot worse things will happen. A lot worse things will happen.
How did we get to this stage? When you allocate responsibility or blame for the position Syria finds itself in today, Assad still in power, violence still continuing, rebel groups still divided, where do you place the blame? Is there a hierarchy of blame that you have in your head?
In Syria now, what you have is a segment of society that has been banished from society, and it is one that refuses not to have a voice in Syria. And it's been labeled as being a fundamentalist group that is not accepted in society or is considered in any...
Excuse me, but if you kill Yazidis and if you kill the Christian minorities in Syria, then you are an Islamic fundamentalist.
Any form of it refusing to accept the standards in this country means that that they're terrorists. So I think that what the main problem that we have in Syria is the labels that have been granted to everyone, and those labels being accepted on an international level. If you look at existing parties in Europe that now support Assad, that openly saying that they support a dictator, whereas if any one individual...
There it comes. There it goes. He's gonna compare Assad to fucking Hitler. So he's saying that if you support Assad and if you say, oh, maybe Assad would be the best guy to be in charge of Syria again because at least under him we didn't have a civil war, right? Right, because he actually will bring stability back to Syria. So if you say that, you are effectively supporting Hitler. Because Hitler is Assad. Assad is Hitler. They're the same. So whenever you bring up Hitler and compare anybody to Hitler, that pretty much means that you have lost the debate. Because all you have is ad hominems. Because how many times did we hear this excuse, right? Saddam Hussein was Hitler. Milosevic was Hitler. Assad is now Hitler. It's ridiculous. If anybody would be, close to Hitler, then it's probably John McCain.
Across Europe said that they supported Hitler, they could face trial.
Where they could face trial if in Europe you could face trial if you support Hitler. But if you support Assad, then you don't face trial. Right? Because Assad is not the same as Hitler. There's a huge difference.
Whereas now it's okay to say that you...
I had a phone call, but let's continue right with this video.
Support a dictator that has killed 500,000
So, Rami,
people.
what would you...
500,000 people have been killed. No, he did not kill 500,000 people. 500,000 people is the estimate of the UN of the total number of people killed in Syria. Of the total number of people killed in Syria. And I would bet that the US killed more people with their airstrikes than the Russians or Assad did. And the US funded insurgents such as the Al-Nusra Front, which is anything but moderate. And of course, the US creation of ISIS.
You say
and has driven half of the country out.
Former UN
half
envoy
of the population
Lakhdar
out of the country.
Brahimi,
That's fine.
who said on this show in March 2016 that there were, quote, no good guys in the Syrian tragedy, i.e. pointing out, yes, Assad's a monster, but there have been some pretty serious mini-monsters faced up against him.
I would say that it took a very long time until there was an actual... I don't think we actually even saw an intervention at any stage. There was no serious approach to solving the problem in Syria. I think that there were many interests of the countries involved that were standing on the sideline and watching to seeing what was going to happen, and maybe hoping that there would be turmoil in the Middle East. And they let this problem go on for way too long. This is the reason that we're where we are.
Alexei, isn't that the reality? Yes, there may be quote-unquote terrorists amongst the opposition, but there are an awful lot of innocent people who just want their freedom from Assad. That hasn't changed over 7 years. And yet your country's air force has joined Assad's air force in bombing and killing those people, a lot of whom just want freedom.
Really, they just want freedom, right? That's why they are waving Al-Qaeda flags and ISIS flags and Al-Nusra flags. Sure, they just want freedom. They don't want to implement Sharia law in Syria. No, they
there
just
are no
want freedom.
saints in any war. That's the first thing. Secondly, yes, Russia joined not Assad as an individual, but Russia supports the existing institutions and state structures, and primarily it's the armed forces who are able to fight on the ground against terrorists. Secondly, yes, Russian air forces are participating in this campaign against terrorists, which is called mainly. They're taking ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra targets. But yes, there are some claims which are not, factually proven that Russian jets were like part of the offense of Eastern Ghouta, which is not the case, for example.
But Alexei, there's a long list of human rights groups, including UN officials, who say Russian aircraft have used unguided bombs, including blast weapons, in densely populated civilian areas, and may have committed war crimes in those civilian areas. You know that. There's plenty of reports documenting that.
Yes, of course, I've heard about those reports. Yes, and I mean, as I already mentioned, there are no saints in any war, and especially in the civil war. When there is a bombing campaign, we've heard lots of times when terrorists use civilians as civilian shields on the and use hospitals and universities and schools packed with kids as human shields. So yes, this is of course the case, and this tragedies happens in Syria for the last years.
Mara, when we look at the sum total of violence in Syria right now, the United States isn't a problem for the United States that you rightly accuse Russia of killing civilians in Syria. That's well documented. But the US has been doing its own bombing campaign in Syria and in Iraq, in which hundreds of coalition airstrikes have killed, according to one air war study, more civilians than Russian airstrikes did at the beginning of last year in the first 3 months of 2020.
How do you respond to that, Brookings Institution's bitch? That the US has killed more people than Russia in Syria. That would kind of, debunk your talking points about humanitarian interventions.
17.
Look, there's no equivalency whatsoever. The Russian...
There's no equivalency whatsoever. The Russians are evil, but when we bomb people, it's good. Right? When we do it, it's good, but the Russians, when they do it, it's fucking evil. Well, actually, the Russians are bombing the insurgents that the United States, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and, a bunch of NATO members have funded for years. And without that insurgency, you never would have a Syrian civil war. Without other countries supplying weapons and funding those groups in Syria, you would not have had a civil war in Syria.
Regime works hand in hand with Assad and his regime, and that has been clearly illustrated, and it preceded ISIS, no doubt. What you are seeing, at least at the American side, fighting, it is trying to fight against groups like ISIS. It is trying to...
No, they're actually not. They're actually trying to prop up ISIS and fund it and give it weapons. I mean, it's just a coincidence that all of the ISIS guys are driving around in US Army Humvees or in US M1 Abrams tanks armed with US M16s. It's just a coincidence that the terrorists just have all of the US weapons. Oh no, we didn't fund those terrorists, we are fighting those terrorists. The Russians, they are not fighting ISIS, they are not fighting those. They're, killing babies, basically, is what she's saying.
To support civilians as much as possible. Absolutely.
But killing a lot of civilians, at one stage more than the Russians between January and April last year.
Civilian casualties have absolutely occurred on the U.S. side, and they have been a tragedy. They are regularly investigated by the U.S. military.
No, they're not. They're not investigated. When was the last time that the U.S. investigated the killing of, hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq? Nobody stood trial for those war crimes. In fact, they were given medals.
There's then a questioning of procedures, rules of engagement, and what needs to change. It seems as though, when you look at how the Russian military has operated in Syria, that actually civilian casualties may be part and parcel of its strategy.
Absolutely not. What would they have to benefit from civilian casualties? If Assad would just be killing people left and right, don't you think that he would have lost support by now from everybody? But he's still in power, and millions of Syrians still support him. So that tells me that he's probably doing some things right.
I don't think so. Simply because it's not in Russia's interest, because it's absolutely not true that it's civilian casualties, collateral damage is a part of Russia's strategy in Syria.
Well, then Russia's military is just pretty incompetent. I mean, it's been pretty clear Russia's military...
Well, the US has killed more people in Syria than Russia has. That's what that guy told you that before. But you're not gonna address that. You're just gonna fucking put the blame on Russia for everything and tell them that they're not fighting ISIS. Of course they're fighting ISIS. You are not you're not fighting ISIS, you're funding ISIS. That's what you're doing in Syria.
Has tried to use Syria as its tactical and operational battleground to test its weapons, to give its military personnel a bit of practice.
That's not the initial reason for going in Syria. Of course, it's during the campaign you test the weapon as well. You test your arms systems on the ground in a real combat.
Okay.
Yes, of course, but it's not the reason. It's not the driver of Russia's involvement in Syria. It's absolutely not true what you're saying.
Russia's involvement in Syria since it intervened. I mean, I'm one of the people that was in Aleppo, and I documented the.
Sure, yeah, Russia is